My mother-in-law told the entire hospital staff our daughter's name was just a placeholder until she could pick something better. Now she's been cut off from seeing her granddaughter completely. When our daughter Ruby was born 4 months ago, Janet showed up to the delivery room with a list of names she'd already approved. Victoria, Elizabeth, Catherine, all these formal traditional names that sounded like dead queens. My husband Neil and I had picked Ruby after my grandmother who raised me. Janet heard the name and actually laughed, said we were joking, right? Nobody names a baby after a rock. Neil told her Ruby was final. We'd already signed the birth certificate. Janet patted my hand like I was a confused child, said hormones make women emotional after birth, that we'd come to our senses once I recovered. She started calling Ruby the baby, or sweet girl, but never her actual name. At the hospital, she told every nurse who came in that we were still deciding on names, that Ruby was just temporary like those generic labels they put on newborn cribs. One nurse actually came back with forms to update the birth certificate because Janet had been so convincing about us changing our minds. When we brought Ruby home, Janet had bought a wooden sign saying Elizabeth's Nursery and hung it on the door while we were still at the hospital. Neil took it down immediately, but she kept bringing new ones. Embroidered blankets with Victoria, silver spoons engraved with Catherine, and a whole christening gown with Margaret stitched across the front. She'd leave them around our house during visits, tucked in the crib, hanging in the closet, like she was trying to manifest a different baby. She initiated a peculiar campaign with Neil's relatives, using different names for Ruby with each person to see which one would stick. Told his aunt we'd named her Rose, told his cousins it was Catherine, told his elderly grandfather she was named after his late wife Dolores. Created this confusion where nobody knew what to call our daughter at family gatherings. People would look at us strange when we said Ruby, like we were the ones being difficult. Then came the pediatrician incident. Janet had been asking about Ruby's appointments, said she wanted to be involved as a loving grandmother. I thought it was sweet, gave her the schedule. She called the office pretending to be me, tried to have them update their records to show Elizabeth Janet Turner instead of Ruby Mae Turner. The receptionist called me to confirm the change. When I confronted Janet, she said she was protecting Ruby from a lifetime of embarrassment, that strippers have names like Ruby, not respectable women. Last month, she started a secret group chat with Neil's side of the family about planning Elizabeth's first Christmas, sent out matching pajama orders with Elizabeth embroidered on them, made dinner reservations under the name, and created a whole gift registry for Elizabeth Turner. Neil's sister finally forwarded me the messages asking if we'd officially changed Ruby's name and not told anyone. The Facebook disaster happened on Sunday. Janet had been quiet for 2 weeks, so I thought maybe she'd finally accepted reality. I posted photos from Ruby's 4-month milestone shoot, just sweet pictures of her in a little dress my mother had sent from Italy. Within an hour, Janet had shared every single photo to her own timeline, but edited all my captions. Where I wrote, Ruby's getting so big, she'd changed it to Elizabeth Victoria Turner, 4 months of perfection. She tagged all her friends, our pediatrician's office, Neil's workplace, even my employer somehow, announcing Elizabeth's official portrait session. But she didn't stop there. She created an entirely new Facebook page called Elizabeth Victoria Turner, Our Precious Princess, using our photos without permission. Added hundreds of her friends as followers, posted daily updates about Elizabeth's schedule, Elizabeth's favorite toys, Elizabeth's sleeping patterns, all using information about Ruby she'd gotten from eavesdropping on our conversations. Posted a birth announcement 4 months late with the wrong name, wrong birth weight because she insisted Ruby had been smaller than she actually was. She even photoshopped a birth certificate showing Elizabeth Victoria Turner and posted it as proof we'd finally fixed the mistake. Neil's phone started exploding with congratulations messages about officially naming our daughter. His boss's wife sent a silver frame engraved with Elizabeth. His uncle sent savings bonds made out to Elizabeth Turner. Everyone thought we'd been calling her the wrong name for months and finally made it legal. Neil called his mother immediately, told her to take everything down. She refused, said social media was her space to share her granddaughter however she wanted, that we couldn't control her expression of love. While they argued, I went into her Facebook and reported every single photo as stolen. Then I commented on each post that this child's name was Ruby Mae Turner, that Janet was spreading false information, and anyone sending gifts to Elizabeth Turner would be wasting their money since that person didn't exist. Janet called, screaming that I was ruining her reputation. Neil grabbed the phone, told her she'd ruined her own reputation by lying about a baby's name for 4 months. Said until she could say Ruby out loud, she wouldn't see Ruby at all. But what she did next was unexpected. The next morning, I was feeding Ruby her bottle when I heard tires screeching in our driveway. Janet's car door slammed so hard the sound echoed through our quiet neighborhood. I put Ruby in her bouncer and went to the window. Janet was marching toward our front door, her face red, her hands clenched into fists. She started pounding on the door before I could even move. Her voice carried through the whole house, screaming about how I'd destroyed her reputation, how I'd turned her own family against her, how I was isolating her from her granddaughter. The neighbors across the street came out on their porch to watch. Janet didn't care. She kept yelling that I was a controlling, manipulative woman who'd brainwashed her son, that she had every right to share photos of her granddaughter however she wanted, that I couldn't silence her. I stood frozen in the hallway, listening to her list every terrible thing she thought about me. Ruby started crying from all the noise. Neil came out of the bedroom pulling on a shirt. He looked at me, then at the door where his mother was still screaming. He walked past me without a word and opened the front door. Janet's face changed instantly when she saw him, going from rage to this wounded, victimized expression. She reached for him, but Neil stepped back onto the porch and pulled the door shut behind him. I could hear their voices through the window, but not the exact words. Janet was gesturing wildly, pointing at the house, at me through the window, her whole body shaking. Neil stood completely still with his arms crossed. Then his voice got louder, and I heard him clearly say he was calling the police if she didn't leave right now. Janet's mouth fell open. She actually looked shocked, like she couldn't believe her own son would threaten her with cops. She said something else, and Neil pulled out his phone, started dialing. Janet stared at him for a long moment, then turned and walked back to her car. She sat in the driver's seat for several minutes just staring at our house. Finally, she started the engine and drove away. Neil came back inside, and we both stood there in the living room, not saying anything. Ruby had stopped crying but was making those little hiccup sounds babies make after they've been upset. I picked her up and held her against my chest. Neil sat down heavily on the couch and ran his hands through his hair. He looked exhausted, and we weren't even past breakfast time. I asked him what she'd said out there. He told me she'd demanded I apologize publicly on Facebook for ruining her reputation, that she wanted me to admit I'd overreacted, and that she'd been trying to help us choose a better name. When he'd refused, she'd said I was turning him against his own mother, that she was going to make sure everyone knew what kind of person I really was. That's when he'd threatened to call the police. We sat there trying to process what had just happened, but something kept bothering me. What did she mean about making sure everyone knew? What had she done that was so unexpected it made her show up here screaming? I grabbed my laptop while Neil held Ruby. We started checking everything. My email first, then Neil's, then our social media accounts. Nothing seemed different at first. Then Neil's phone started buzzing. One notification, then another, then 5 more in quick succession. Text messages, missed calls, voicemails, all coming in at once like someone had opened a floodgate. His cousin asking if we were okay, his aunt saying she was worried, his uncle asking what was going on with the baby. Neil opened his email, and there it was. A message from his mother sent to what looked like every single person in his family. The subject line said, "Urgent family matter." I read over his shoulder and felt my stomach drop. Janet had written this long, concerned email about how we were suffering from serious postpartum mental health issues. She said I was experiencing postpartum psychosis and had become delusional about our daughter's name. She claimed Neil was too stressed from work to see how bad things had gotten. She said the baby was in an unstable environment and needed intervention before something terrible happened. And attached to the email was that fake birth certificate she'd photoshopped, the one showing Elizabeth Victoria Turner. She'd used it as proof that we were delusional, that we'd been calling our daughter the wrong name for months. Neil's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. He answered one call from his aunt, the one married to Mateo. She sounded genuinely worried, asking if we needed help, if we'd considered talking to someone professional. She said Janet's email had been so detailed and concerned that she'd included medical information about postpartum psychosis symptoms. Neil tried to explain that his mother was lying, that she'd been the one refusing to use Ruby's real name, but I could tell from his face that his aunt wasn't fully believing him. She kept saying maybe we should get evaluated just to be safe, that there was no shame in getting help if we needed it. Neil finally told her he had to go and hung up. 3 more calls came in immediately. He didn't answer them. My own phone started ringing. My boss's name showed on the screen. My heart started pounding. I answered and tried to sound normal. She asked if everything was okay at home, said someone from HR had received a concerning call about me. I asked what kind of call. She explained that a woman claiming to be a family member had contacted HR saying I was experiencing a mental health crisis and might be a danger to vulnerable populations. Since I work with elderly clients, HR had to take the concern seriously. My boss said she didn't believe it, that I'd seemed completely fine before I went on maternity leave, but she had to ask if there was any truth to the claim. I told her about Janet, about the name situation, about everything that had been happening. My boss was quiet for a moment, then said she'd let HR know it was a family dispute and not a legitimate concern. She asked if I needed to extend my leave to deal with the situation. I said no, that I'd be back on schedule in 2 weeks. After we hung up, I just sat there staring at my phone. Janet had actually called my workplace. She'd tried to make them think I was unstable, that I shouldn't be around vulnerable people. She'd tried to ruin my career over a baby's name. Neil started calling people back, his cousin first, then his uncle, then his other aunt. Each conversation went basically the same way. He'd explain what was really happening, and they'd sound skeptical. These people had known Janet for decades. She was family. She'd seemed so genuinely worried in her email, so concerned for our well-being and the baby's safety. Neil's voice got more frustrated with each call. He kept having to repeat himself, Kept having to explain that no, we weren't having a breakdown. Yes, our daughter's name really was Ruby. No, his mother wasn't just a concerned grandmother. Some people seemed to believe him eventually. Others stayed doubtful. One of his cousins actually suggested maybe we were all stressed and needed to work this out in family therapy together, like the problem was equal on both sides. Then Bianca called. Neil put her on speaker. She said she needed to tell us something, that she'd been feeling guilty about it for weeks. She'd been uncomfortable with their mother's behavior for months, but hadn't wanted to cause family drama by saying anything. She said watching Janet's campaign to rename Ruby had made her realize their mother had serious control issues, but she'd told herself it wasn't her place to interfere. Then she'd gotten Janet's mass email this morning and realized she couldn't stay quiet anymore. She said she was forwarding us something right now, that we needed to see it. My email pinged. There was a message from Bianca with screenshots attached. It was the group chat Janet had created, the one about planning Elizabeth's first Christmas. Bianca had been included in it the whole time. The messages went back weeks, showing Janet planning this whole fake identity campaign. She'd been organizing it systematically, getting people to buy gifts with the wrong name, making reservations, creating this alternate reality where Ruby was actually Elizabeth. The screenshots were proof that Janet had been planning this deception for a long time, that it wasn't just a grandmother having trouble with a name choice. Neil thanked his sister and said he needed to figure out what to do next. After he hung up, we just looked at each other. This was bigger than we'd thought. Janet hadn't just been stubborn or boundary crossing. She'd been running an organized campaign to change our daughter's identity, and when that hadn't worked, she'd tried to make everyone think we were mentally unstable. Neil said we needed legal advice. He mentioned Sebastian Hancock, a family lawyer his company had used for some employee issues. He called the law office and explained the situation to the receptionist. She said Sebastian could see us in 3 days. 3 days felt like forever, but we took the appointment. At least we'd have professional guidance on what to do next. While we were still processing everything, my phone buzzed with a Facebook notification. Janet had posted on her personal page. The post said she was silenced and alienated by her son's controlling wife, that she was being kept from her precious granddaughter for trying to help her son see reason. She said she was heartbroken but would never give up fighting for her grandbaby's well-being. The post already had dozens of comments from her friends. They were all sympathetic, all supporting her, all saying what a terrible daughter-in-law I must be. None of them knew the real story. None of them knew about the fake Facebook page, the photoshopped birth certificate, the attempted medical record changes, the lies to everyone we knew. They just saw a grandmother claiming to be victimized by her son's wife. I showed Neil the post. He closed his eyes and leaned back against the couch. Ruby had fallen asleep in his arms, completely unaware that her grandmother was waging war over her name and trying to convince the world her parents were unfit. I grabbed my phone and started taking screenshots of everything before Janet could delete it. The fake Facebook page with all our stolen photos, the photoshopped birth certificate showing Elizabeth Victoria Turner, the mass email she'd sent to Neil's family claiming we were having mental health problems, every single message from the group chat about planning Elizabeth's first Christmas. I saved each image to a folder on my laptop, then backed them up to cloud storage because I didn't trust that this wouldn't get worse. Neil watched me work and started doing the same thing on his phone, capturing the posts Janet's friends were making about how terrible I was for keeping a grandmother from her grandchild. We spent over an hour documenting everything, building a file of every lie she'd told and every boundary she'd crossed in the past 4 months. By the time we finished, Ruby had woken up and needed to be fed. I sat in the nursery with her, trying to focus on her sweet face instead of the anger burning in my chest. The next morning, Neil's phone rang while he was getting ready for work. His boss, Gregorio, wanted to see him in the office as soon as he arrived. Neil looked worried when he hung up. At work, Gregorio closed his office door and asked if everything was okay at home. Several coworkers had seen Janet's Facebook post about being kept from her granddaughter and were concerned about Neil's situation. Neil had to sit there and explain to his boss that his mother was lying about his daughter's name, which sounded completely absurd even as he was saying the words out loud. He showed Gregorio the screenshots of the fake Facebook page, the photoshopped documents, the proof that Janet had been running this campaign to change Ruby's identity. Gregorio looked stunned but said he understood, and that Neil should let him know if he needed any time off to deal with family issues. That same afternoon, the pediatrician's office called my cell. The receptionist Mary said they needed to talk to me about Ruby's account. My stomach dropped because I knew this had to be about Janet. Mary explained that because of Janet's previous attempt to change Ruby's medical records by pretending to be me, they'd flagged our account for security. She asked if we'd be willing to set up a password system, so that only Neil or I could make changes or get information about Ruby's care. I said yes immediately, and we picked a password right there on the phone. Then Mary asked if we wanted to add any notes to Ruby's file about who was and wasn't authorized to access her information. I told her we needed to add that Janet Esposito was not authorized to receive any information or make any decisions about Ruby's medical care. Mary was incredibly understanding about the whole thing. She said this wasn't the first time they'd dealt with grandparents who crossed boundaries, and that protecting the baby was always their first priority. After I hung up, I felt relieved that at least Ruby's medical information was secure now, but also sad that we had to take these steps at all. 2 days later, my phone buzzed with a voicemail notification. Janet had called while I was in a meeting. I listened to the message and heard her crying, saying we were committing parental alienation by keeping her from Ruby. She said she had grandparent rights, and that we couldn't just cut her out of her granddaughter's life completely over a disagreement about names. Her voice got louder as she talked, insisting that courts would side with her because she was only trying to protect Ruby from our poor choices. I played the voicemail for Neil when he got home. He looked tired and frustrated. That night, he spent hours on his laptop researching grandparent rights laws in our state. What he found was actually reassuring. Grandparents could only ask for visits in specific situations like divorce or death of a parent. None of those things applied to us. We were married and both alive and involved in Ruby's life. Janet didn't have any legal standing to demand access to our daughter. Neil took screenshots of the relevant laws and added them to our growing documentation folder. The day before our appointment with Sebastian, I went to the grocery store to pick up formula and diapers. I was standing in the baby aisle when someone touched my arm. It was Liliana, one of Janet's closest friends who I'd met at a few family gatherings. She gave me this sad smile and said she wanted to talk to me about Janet. Liliana said everyone was so worried about Janet's broken heart, and that maybe I was being a little cruel by keeping a grandmother from her granddaughter over something as silly as a name preference. She said it in this gentle voice like she was trying to help me see reason. I took a breath and looked at her directly. I explained that Janet had been calling Ruby by fake names for 4 months, told different family members different names to create confusion, created a fake Facebook page with a false identity for my daughter, and tried to change Ruby's medical records without permission by pretending to be me. I said this wasn't about a name preference. It was about Janet refusing to accept that Ruby was our daughter, and we got to name her. Liliana's face changed as I talked. She looked genuinely stunned, like this version of events had never occurred to her. She asked if I was serious about the medical records and the fake Facebook page. I pulled out my phone and showed her some of the screenshots. Her mouth actually fell open when she saw the photoshopped birth certificate. She apologized and said she had no idea things were that serious, that Janet had made it sound like we were just being stubborn about accepting her input. The next morning, Neil and I sat in Sebastian's office downtown. He was a family lawyer in his 50s who'd helped Neil's company with some employee issues before. We showed him everything. The fake Facebook page, the photoshopped birth certificate, the mass email claiming we had mental health problems, the group chat planning Elizabeth's Christmas, the voicemail about grandparent rights, the pediatrician's notes about Janet trying to change Ruby's records. Sebastian looked through it all carefully, and then leaned back in his chair. He said Janet's behavior was definitely disturbing and qualified as harassment, but it didn't quite meet the legal threshold for identity fraud because she hadn't gained any financial benefit or caused measurable damages that we could prove in court. However, he said we absolutely had grounds for a cease and desist letter and potentially a restraining order if the harassment continued after that. He asked if we wanted him to draft the letter. Neil and I looked at each other and both nodded. Sebastian opened his laptop and started typing while we sat there. He asked specific questions about what we wanted included. We told him the letter needed to demand that Janet stop using any name other than Ruby Mae Turner. When talking about our daughter, remove all the social media content about Elizabeth, and stop contacting our employers, medical providers, and extended family with lies about our parenting decisions. Sebastian's fingers moved across the keyboard as he wrote. He read sections out loud as he went, making sure the language was clear and firm. The letter stated that continued harassment would result in us seeking a restraining order, and that any future attempts to access Ruby's medical records or interfere with our parenting would be reported to authorities. Sebastian printed the letter on his firm's official paper, and had his assistant prepare the certified mail envelope right there in the office. We watched her attach the tracking number and receipt form, making sure Janet's address was exactly right. Sebastian explained that certified mail requires a signature on delivery, which creates a legal record of when Janet received the letter, and that she couldn't claim she never got it. He handed us a copy of the letter for our records, and told us to start a documentation folder immediately. Anytime Janet violated the terms in the letter, we needed to write down the date, time, what happened, and save any evidence like voicemails, texts, emails, or screenshots. He said courts take cease and desist violations seriously because they show a pattern of intentional harassment after being formally warned to stop. The letter went out that afternoon. We got the tracking notification on our phones and checked it obsessively for 2 days, until the status changed to delivered with Janet's signature captured digitally. 3 hours after the delivery confirmation came through, Neil's phone rang with his mother's number. He looked at me and I nodded, so he answered on speaker. Janet was crying so hard at first that we couldn't understand what she was saying. When she finally got words out, she kept repeating that she couldn't believe her own son would threaten her with legal action over trying to help. She said the letter made her sound like some kind of criminal when all she'd done was express concern about a name choice. Neil let her talk for a minute, then interrupted to say the letter wasn't about expressing concern. He told her she'd tried to change Ruby's medical records, created a fake identity online, and lied to everyone they knew for months. Janet's crying stopped and her voice got sharp. She said she was only trying to help us see reason before Ruby got old enough to be embarrassed by her name. Said we were overreacting to a grandmother's natural concern and making her out to be some kind of monster when she'd always just wanted what was best for the baby. Neil took a breath and I could see him trying to stay calm. He said the only path forward was for her to respect Ruby's name and our boundaries as parents. Told her once she could do that consistently, we might discuss supervised visits, but right now she wasn't welcome in our home or our daughter's life. Janet made this sound like a gasp, and then the line went dead. She'd hung up on him. Neil stared at his phone for a second, then set it down on the kitchen table. We didn't hear anything else from Janet that evening, but the next morning, Bianca sent me a screenshot of their mother's Facebook. Janet had posted a vague status about toxic children who abandon their parents after everything they've sacrificed. The post didn't mention names, but anyone who knew Janet would know she meant Neil. Her friends flooded the comments with support, saying things like children these days have no respect, and asking what she'd done to deserve such treatment. One of her friends even commented that she should sue for grandparent rights because no grandmother should be kept from her grandbaby. I showed Neil the screenshot and watched his jaw tighten. He wanted to comment and tell everyone the truth, but I reminded him that engaging would just give Janet more attention. Later that afternoon, Bianca texted that their mother had shown up at her house crying and asking her to mediate between us. Bianca said she'd told Janet the truth, that she needed to respect Ruby's name and apologize for the lying campaign. Janet apparently stormed out saying her own children had turned against her and she had nobody left. Bianca felt bad but said she couldn't keep pretending their mother's behavior was okay. Then everything went quiet. For 2 whole weeks, Janet didn't call, didn't text, didn't post anything about us on social media. My phone stayed silent and Neil's did too. It should have felt like relief, but instead it felt like waiting for something bad to happen. I kept checking Janet's Facebook to see if she was posting anything, but her page just had normal stuff about her garden and her book club. Every time my phone buzzed, I expected it to be some new crisis, some new way Janet had found to make our lives difficult. Neil said maybe the cease and desist letter had actually worked. Maybe his mother finally understood we were serious. I wanted to believe him, but something felt off about the sudden silence. On the 15th day, Mateo called Neil right after dinner. He said Janet had contacted him asking for money to hire a lawyer to sue for grandparent visitation rights. She'd told Mateo we were keeping Ruby away from her for no reason, and that the courts would force us to let her see her granddaughter. Mateo said he'd refused to give her money, and told her she just needed to accept her granddaughter's actual name, which made Janet furious. She'd yelled at him about how everyone in the family was against her and hung up. Mateo wanted to warn us that Janet was actively looking for legal help. The next day, Bianca called with more news. She'd been talking to Neil's cousin and learned that Janet had been telling extended family members we were planning to move across the country to keep Ruby away from her. This was completely made up because we had no plans to move anywhere. But Janet was building this whole story where she was the victim of our cruelty. Some relatives actually believed it, and were asking Bianca if it was true. My maternity leave ended the following Monday, and I went back to work feeling anxious about leaving Ruby with the babysitter, worried about what Janet might try next. My boss called me into her office on my second day back. She looked annoyed rather than concerned this time, and told me Janet had called the office twice more despite the cease and desist letter. HR had flagged Janet's number in their system to block future calls, and my boss wanted me to know they were taking it seriously. I apologized, but my boss said it wasn't my fault, that she dealt with difficult family members before, and understood boundary issues. That evening, I called Sebastian and told him about Janet's continued contact with my employer. He asked if I had the dates and times of the calls, which I got from my boss. Sebastian said Janet's continued contact after receiving the cease and desist letter was a clear violation we could use to pursue a restraining order. He explained that judges look at patterns of behavior, and someone who keeps harassing after being formally told to stop shows they won't respect boundaries without court enforcement. We started gathering all our documentation into one folder, everything from the fake Facebook page to the photoshopped birth certificate to the employer contact records. Before we could even call Sebastian to schedule filing the restraining order, Liliana sent me a Facebook message that completely caught me off guard. She apologized for believing Janet's lies and said she'd confronted Janet after running into me at the grocery store, which made Janet admit she'd been exaggerating things to get family support. Liliana said she felt awful for not questioning Janet's stories earlier and wanted to help fix the damage. I showed Neil the message, and he stared at it for a long time before saying, "This changed everything about our case." Liliana sent another message an hour later offering to write down everything Janet had told her, including the admission about lying to family and friends about our mental health and Ruby's name. She said she'd sign it and get it notarized if we needed it for court. I forwarded everything to Sebastian, who responded within minutes, saying a statement from one of Janet's own friends admitting Janet had been lying would be incredibly valuable evidence if we pursued legal action. Neil spent that whole evening pacing around the living room trying to decide if he should give his mother one more chance before we filed papers that would become public record and possibly destroy their relationship forever. He kept picking up his phone and putting it back down, clearly torn between protecting his daughter and cutting off his own mother. Finally, around 9 that night, he called Janet and put her on speaker so I could hear. He told her this was her absolute last opportunity to fix things, that she needed to acknowledge Ruby's real name, stop lying to family, and agree to go to family therapy before any visits could happen. Janet laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound, more like she thought Neil was being ridiculous. She said she would never call her granddaughter a stripper name, and that we'd regret cutting her out when Ruby grew up asking why she didn't have a grandmother who loved her. Then she hung up before Neil could say anything else. Neil just stood there holding his phone looking like he might throw up. I reminded him that Sebastian had told him to record any conversations with Janet since we live in a state where only one person needs to know about the recording for it to be legal. Neil checked his phone and confirmed the whole call had been captured. That recording became the final piece we needed because Janet had explicitly refused to use Ruby's legal name and made it clear the harassment would continue no matter what we did. We sent the recording to Sebastian along with Liliana's statement and all our other documentation. Sebastian called back the next morning saying we had enough for a temporary restraining order and he'd start preparing the paperwork immediately. The petition listed everything: the documented harassment over 4 months, the cease and desist letter violations, the multiple contacts with my employer after being told to stop, the attempts to change Ruby's medical records, and create a fake identity online, and the recorded phone call where Janet refused to respect boundaries. Sebastian filed everything with the court and told us the hearing date was set for 3 weeks out, which felt like forever to wait. But he said that was actually pretty fast for family court. A process server went to Janet's house 2 days later to deliver the restraining order petition. Within 3 hours of being served, Janet posted on Facebook about being legally attacked by her ungrateful son and his controlling wife. I got messages from people I'd never met telling me I was a horrible person and that I'd poisoned Neil against his own mother. Neil got similar messages, plus a few from his dad's side of the family, asking what was really going on. I made all my social media accounts completely private and blocked anyone I didn't personally know. Neil did the same after someone sent him a message saying they hoped Ruby would grow up to hate us for what we were doing. Bianca saw her mother's Facebook post and left a public comment that said Janet had tried to change Ruby's medical records and created a fake identity for her online, and that this wasn't about nothing. I watched the comment appear and then disappear less than 5 minutes later because Janet must have deleted it immediately. But Bianca texted us saying she'd screenshotted her own comment before posting it, and several other family members had grabbed screenshots too. Those screenshots started getting shared in private family group chats. Neil's cousin forwarded us a conversation where people were asking each other if Janet had really tried to change medical records and create a fake Facebook page. Some relatives who'd been on Janet's side started questioning whether they'd gotten the full story. Mateo called Neil that evening to apologize for initially believing Janet's version of what was happening. He said once he heard about the medical records thing and saw proof of the fake Facebook page, he realized Janet had been lying to everyone about everything. Mateo told Neil he'd be willing to testify at the restraining order hearing if we needed him to, that he'd tell the judge how Janet had asked him for money to sue for grandparent rights and had been spreading false stories about us planning to move across the country. 3 weeks later, we sat in the courthouse waiting room while Sebastian organized our evidence folders. Neil kept tapping his foot against the tile floor, making this repetitive clicking sound that normally would have driven me crazy, but today I barely noticed because my own hands wouldn't stop shaking. Sebastian had printed everything out, organized it with tabs and labels, made it look official and serious instead of just screenshots from a crazy mother-in-law's Facebook rampage. The fake Elizabeth Victoria Turner page, the photoshopped birth certificate, emails from my HR department about Janet's calls, the cease and desist letter she'd ignored, the recorded phone call where she laughed at using Ruby's name. All of it stacked in neat piles that made 4 months of harassment look as bad as it actually was. Janet arrived with her lawyer, some guy in an expensive suit who kept whispering to her while she dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. She was dressed like she was going to church, all proper and respectable, the complete opposite of the woman who'd created a fake online identity for our baby. When we walked into the courtroom, she looked at Neil with this wounded expression, like he was the one who'd done something wrong. The judge came in and Sebastian stood up to present our case. He walked through each piece of evidence methodically, explaining how Janet had refused to use Ruby's legal name since birth, how she'd told hospital staff the name was temporary, how she'd tried to change medical records by impersonating me. He showed the judge the fake Facebook page with hundreds of posts about Elizabeth, the photoshopped birth certificate Janet had shared publicly, the group chat where she'd planned an entire Christmas for a child with the wrong name. He played the recorded phone call where Janet explicitly said she'd never call her granddaughter a stripper name. The judge's expression got more serious with each piece of evidence, her eyebrows pulling together as she looked through the printed screenshots. Janet's lawyer stood up and started talking about how this was just a family disagreement that got blown out of proportion, that grandmothers sometimes have strong opinions about baby names, and that doesn't make them dangerous. He said Janet was simply expressing concern about an unusual name choice, that she loved her granddaughter and only wanted what was best for her. The judge held up her hand to stop him mid-sentence. She said attempting to change a child's medical records by impersonating a parent wasn't expressing concern. It was identity fraud. She said creating fake online identities and spreading false information about a baby's legal name went far beyond having an opinion about names. She looked directly at Janet and said this pattern of behavior showed a refusal to accept basic parental authority and boundaries that was deeply concerning. The judge granted a 1-year restraining order right there, no hesitation. She said Janet couldn't contact us directly or indirectly, couldn't come within 500 feet of our home or workplaces, couldn't post anything about Ruby on social media. She said Janet's behavior demonstrated an alarming inability to respect us as parents, and that until she could acknowledge Ruby's actual legal name, she had no business being around our daughter. Janet started crying immediately, these loud sobs that echoed in the quiet courtroom. She stood up even though her lawyer was trying to get her to sit back down, and she said we were keeping her from her only granddaughter over a simple disagreement about a name. The judge's face didn't change at all. She said if Janet had simply respected her granddaughter's legal name from the beginning, none of this would have been necessary. She said Janet's continued refusal to use Ruby's name even here in court proved exactly why the restraining order was appropriate. She told Janet to sit down and accept the ruling, or she'd be held in contempt. We walked out of the courtroom and I felt like I could finally breathe properly for the first time in weeks. Sebastian was talking about next steps and documentation, but I was just focused on getting to the car and going home to see Ruby. We'd left her with Neil's cousin who'd proven herself trustworthy by consistently using Ruby's actual name. We made it to the parking lot and were almost at our car when I heard Janet calling Neil's name. She was walking toward us fast, her lawyer trailing behind trying to stop her. Sebastian immediately pulled out his phone and called the police while stepping between Janet and us. She was still crying, makeup running down her face, saying she just needed to talk to her son for 1 minute. A police car that had been parked near the courthouse pulled up within 2 minutes. The officer got out and Sebastian showed him the fresh restraining order, explained Janet was already violating it by approaching us. The officer walked over to Janet and told her very clearly that she needed to leave the area immediately, or she'd be arrested for violating a court order. Her lawyer finally got her to turn around and walk back to her own car. She kept looking back at Neil like he might change his mind and call her back. The next few days, my phone started getting messages from people I barely knew. Some of Janet's friends who'd left nasty comments on my Facebook were now apologizing, saying they had no idea how serious her behavior had actually been. They'd thought it was just a grandmother being kept away over nothing, but after the restraining order became public knowledge through family gossip, they realized there must have been real problems. Several of Neil's relatives reached out too, apologizing for believing Janet's version of events without asking us what was really happening. They said they felt manipulated now that they knew she'd been lying about everything. Bianca called and asked if she could come over for dinner that weekend. She said she wanted to meet Ruby properly, using her real name, and apologize for not standing up to their mother sooner. When she arrived on Saturday, she brought this beautiful baby blanket with Ruby Mae Turner embroidered across the bottom in pink thread. She held Ruby carefully and kept saying her name over and over like she was making up for months of avoiding it. She told us she'd always known their mother was controlling, but seeing it directed at a baby made her realize how unhealthy the family dynamics had always been. She said she wanted to be an Aunt Ruby could count on, someone who would always respect our decisions as parents. Neil started going to therapy 2 weeks after the hearing. He'd been quiet since the courtroom, processing everything that had happened. His therapist helped him see that his mother's controlling behavior wasn't new. It had been there his whole life. He just never questioned it because that was normal in his family. Having Ruby made him finally see how wrong it was for a parent to try to override every decision, to refuse to accept basic boundaries, to manipulate and lie to get her way. He came home from sessions looking tired but also lighter somehow, like he was putting down weight he'd been carrying forever. Over the next few months, he worked through a lot of complicated feelings about his mother, about his childhood, about the family patterns he didn't want to repeat with Ruby. We celebrated Ruby's first birthday in August with a small party at our house. Just close friends and the few family members who'd proven they respected our boundaries and consistently used Ruby's real name. Bianca came with her husband and kids. Mateo came with his wife and brought a savings bond he'd had reissued in Ruby's correct legal name. Everyone sang happy birthday to Ruby, not Elizabeth, not any other name Janet had tried to force on her. We had a cake with Ruby's name written in frosting and decorations that said, "Ruby is one," hanging from the ceiling. It felt like claiming back something that should have been simple from the start. Janet violated the restraining order twice during that first year. The first time was a birthday card that arrived in our mailbox 2 days before Ruby's party, addressed to Elizabeth Turner with a return address from Janet. We documented it with photos and filed a report with the police. The second violation came through Facebook when one of Janet's friends sent me a message asking about Elizabeth's first birthday party and whether they could send a gift. The message made it clear Janet had put her up to it, probably fed her some story about us being difficult. We documented that one too and reported it to the court. Sebastian said we had grounds to pursue charges for the violations, but we decided not to unless she kept it up. She was staying away otherwise, and that was what really mattered. When the restraining order came up for renewal a year later, Sebastian got a call from Janet's lawyer asking if we'd consider supervised visitation if Janet completed family therapy and agreed to use Ruby's legal name. Neil and I sat at our kitchen table discussing it while Ruby napped upstairs. We were skeptical after everything that had happened. all the lies and manipulation and boundary violations. But Sebastian said Janet's lawyer sounded genuine. Said Janet had been following the order completely for 12 months with no violations beyond those first 2. We told Sebastian we'd consider it only if Janet actually followed through with real therapy, not just a few sessions to check a box. 3 weeks later, Sebastian called back to say Janet had enrolled in a therapy program specializing in family boundaries and controlling behaviors. We didn't hear anything for months after that, and honestly I figured Janet would quit after a few sessions once the therapist started challenging her. But 3 months in, a therapist named Dr. Miller reached out to Sebastian asking if we'd be willing to do a mediated conversation. Dr. Miller explained she'd been working with Janet on understanding that her behavior had been about control rather than love, that refusing to respect basic boundaries had destroyed her relationship with her granddaughter. The therapist said Janet was making real progress but needed to take accountability directly to us as part of her healing process. Neil and I talked about it for days. Part of me wanted to just keep Janet out of our lives forever after everything she'd put us through. But Neil pointed out that Ruby was getting older and might eventually ask about her grandmother, and we didn't want to be the ones keeping them apart if Janet had genuinely changed. We agreed to one meeting at Dr. Miller's office with Ruby staying home with a babysitter. The day of the meeting I was so nervous I could barely eat breakfast. We drove to the therapist's office in this medical building downtown and sat in the waiting room until Dr. Miller came out to get us. Janet was already in the office sitting in a chair across from a couch. She looked older than I remembered, more tired. Dr. Miller explained the ground rules, that this was a space for Janet to take accountability and for us to express how her actions had affected our family. Janet's hands were shaking when she started talking. She said she was sorry for not respecting Ruby's name and for trying to control our parenting decisions. The words sounded uncomfortable coming out of her mouth, but her eyes looked genuine. Not like she was just saying what she thought we wanted to hear. She admitted she'd been wrong to create the fake Facebook page, wrong to try to change Ruby's medical records, wrong to lie to the entire family about us changing her name. Dr. Miller asked her why she'd done those things, and Janet got quiet for a long moment. Then she said she'd always believed that old-fashioned names were more respectable, that names like Victoria and Elizabeth carried weight and dignity. She couldn't understand why we'd choose something she saw as too casual, almost frivolous. The therapist gently pointed out that Janet's personal preferences didn't override our rights as Ruby's parents, that we'd chosen a name with meaningful family history that honored my grandmother who raised me. Janet nodded and said she understood that now, that Ruby was a beautiful name and she'd been wrong to reject it. We sat there for over an hour talking through everything that had happened. Janet admitted she'd spent her whole life trying to control situations and people around her, that having a grandchild had triggered all these expectations about how things should be. Dr. Miller helped her see that love meant accepting people as they were, not trying to force them into the vision she had in her head. By the end of the session, we agreed to try supervised visits at a neutral location. We picked a park 3 blocks from our house where Janet could see Ruby for 1 hour every other week, while Neil and I stayed present the entire time. The first visit 2 weeks later was incredibly awkward. Janet arrived at the park right on time carrying a small gift bag. Ruby was 14 months old by then, walking and babbling, and she had no memory of Janet at all. Janet knelt down and said hello to Ruby, using her real name, which felt like this massive victory even though it should have been basic from the start. She'd brought a stuffed elephant with Ruby's name embroidered on one ear. Ruby grabbed it and toddled around the playground while Janet watched with tears in her eyes. Neil and I sat on a bench nearby, ready to intervene if Janet slipped up, but she didn't. She called Ruby by her real name the entire hour, asked permission before taking any photos on her phone, and left exactly when the hour was up without arguing for more time. Over the next 6 months, we kept up the every other week park visits, and slowly Janet rebuilt trust. She brought gifts that all had Ruby's real name on them, nothing with Elizabeth or Victoria or any of the other names she'd tried to force. She asked permission before posting any photos to social media, and actually respected our answer when we said no to certain pictures. She started respecting our parenting decisions even when she clearly disagreed, biting her tongue instead of offering constant criticism. There were still moments where I could see her wanting to take over or correct how we did things, but she'd catch herself and step back. Ruby turned 18 months, then 20 months, and Janet showed up consistently to every scheduled visit. She never violated the boundaries we'd set, never tried to see Ruby outside the agreed times, never contacted our employers or doctors, or tried any of the manipulation tactics from before. Neil started to relax around his mother in a way I hadn't seen in years. When Ruby was almost 2 years old, we finally agreed to let Janet visit our home again. She arrived with a gift bag and pulled out a wooden sign that said, "Ruby's room" in painted letters with little gemstones around the border. She said she wanted to replace the Elizabeth's nursery sign she'd hung during our hospital stay 2 years earlier. Neil actually started crying when he saw it, this gesture that acknowledged how wrong she'd been, and showed she was trying to make it right. We hung the sign on Ruby's door together, and Janet ran her fingers over Ruby's name like she was memorizing it. She still had moments where she struggled with boundaries. Once she suggested we should reconsider Ruby's preschool choice because it wasn't as academic as she thought it should be. But then she caught herself mid-sentence and said, "Never mind. that she trusted us to make the right choice for our daughter. She apologized for overstepping and changed the subject. Those moments showed she was genuinely working on herself, that she understood respecting our family meant accepting we made the decisions for Ruby, not her. By the time Ruby's second birthday came around in August, we felt comfortable enough to invite Janet to the family party at our house. She arrived early and actually helped set up decorations, hanging streamers and balloons that all said Ruby's name in big letters. When guests arrived, she introduced herself as Ruby's grandmother and told people about how Ruby was named after her great-grandmother who'd raised me in Italy. She spoke with genuine pride instead of the embarrassment and shame she'd shown 2 years earlier. She helped cut the cake that had Ruby Mae Turner written in frosting and sang happy birthday using the right name. The extended family situation was still complicated, though. Most people had moved past the drama once they understood the full story of what Janet had done, but some members remained distant. A few of Neil's cousins never really forgave Janet for the manipulation and lying, for making them all look foolish when they'd sent gifts to Elizabeth Turner. They came to Ruby's party but kept their distance from Janet, polite but cold. Other relatives had taken sides during the restraining order period, and those relationships never fully recovered. But Bianca had become one of our closest family allies through everything. She brought her kids to Ruby's party, and they played together in the backyard, while Bianca helped me in the kitchen. Mateo came with his wife and gave Ruby a savings bond he'd had properly reissued in her correct legal name, joking that third time's the charm since he'd already sent 2 to Elizabeth Turner by mistake. His kids adored Ruby and treated her like a little princess, letting her toddle after them and join their games. Those relationships, the ones that had survived the crisis and come out stronger, meant more to us than the ones we'd lost. We had a smaller family circle now, but it was built on people who'd proven they respected boundaries and stood by us when things got hard. The whole experience brought Neil and me closer than we'd been in years. Before Ruby was born, we'd argue about little things like whose turn it was to do dishes or whether to visit his family for holidays. Now we'd stood together through something that tested everything about us as a couple. Neil choosing our family over his mother's demands was huge for him. He'd spent his whole life trying to keep peace with Janet, avoiding confrontation, making excuses for her behavior. Watching him tell his own mother she couldn't see Ruby until she respected our daughter's name, that was the moment I knew our marriage would survive anything. We started having these conversations late at night after Ruby went to sleep, talking about what kind of parents we wanted to be and what boundaries we needed to protect. Neil admitted he'd been scared of becoming like his mother, controlling and manipulative, so he'd swung too far the other way and let people walk all over him. Standing up to Janet taught him he could be firm without being cruel, that protecting his family wasn't the same as being controlling. We made decisions together now instead of me just going along with what he wanted to avoid conflict. Our marriage felt like a real partnership instead of 2 people trying not to upset each other. Ruby turned into this amazing little person who had no idea about any of the drama around her name. She ran around our house singing songs, playing with her toys, giving us sticky kisses with her juice-covered mouth. At 2 years old, she could say her own name perfectly, would tell anyone who asked that she was Ruby, just like her great-grandma. She had Janet's dark hair but my grandmother's green eyes, this perfect mix of both families that made my heart hurt sometimes. She loved books and would bring me the same 3 stories over and over, climbing into my lap and pointing at the pictures. Her favorite was about a little girl who goes on adventures, and Ruby would say the girl's name loud and proud every time we read it. She had friends at daycare who knew her as Ruby, teachers who wrote her name on her artwork, a whole life built on her real identity. Sometimes I'd watch her playing and think about how close we came to letting Janet erase who she was. Ruby would never remember the fake Facebook page or the photoshopped birth certificate or any of Janet's attempts to rename her. She'd grow up knowing her parents protected her from the start, that her name meant something important to us. That security, that foundation of knowing she was loved and valued exactly as she was, that's what we fought for. Last month, Janet called Neil and asked if she could take Ruby to the park by herself. Just the 2 of them. An hour at the playground near our house. No parents watching. Neil came to me right away and we talked it through for days. Janet had been doing so well with supervised visits, always using Ruby's name, respecting our rules about snacks and screen time. She'd rebuilt trust slowly over 18 months of therapy and consistent behavior, but letting her take Ruby alone felt different, like we were taking off the training wheels and hoping she wouldn't crash. We decided to try it on a Saturday morning when we'd both be home and available if anything went wrong. I packed Ruby's backpack with snacks and her water bottle, reminded Janet about the sunscreen, tried not to show how nervous I felt. Ruby was excited to go with Grandma, didn't pick up on my anxiety at all. They left at 10 in the morning and were supposed to be back by 11:30. I watched the clock the whole time, checked my phone every 5 minutes even though I knew Janet wouldn't text while watching Ruby. At 11:28 exactly, I heard Janet's car pull into the driveway. Ruby came running in talking about the swings and the slide, her cheeks pink from playing outside. Janet followed her in and showed me photos on her phone, Ruby grinning on the monkey bars, Ruby going down the slide, Ruby picking dandelions in the grass. Then Janet texted me the photos with a caption that made my throat tight. Fun afternoon with my beautiful granddaughter Ruby. Not Elizabeth, not any of the names she'd tried to force on us. Ruby. Her real name typed out clearly where anyone could see it. Janet met my eyes when I looked up from my phone and gave me this small smile that said she understood what those photos meant, what that caption represented. The healing felt real because it was earned through months of hard work and genuine change. Looking back now, I'm glad I reported those Facebook posts, even though it started months of hell. Standing firm on boundaries cost us relationships with some family members who thought we overreacted. The restraining order and court hearings were expensive and stressful, and made us look like the bad guys to people who didn't understand. But Ruby deserved parents who would protect her identity from day one. She deserved a family that respected who she was instead of trying to turn her into someone else. Sometimes protecting your child means fighting battles you never expected to face. It means telling your mother-in-law no and sticking to it even when she cries. It means getting lawyers involved and going to court and looking like the difficult ones. It means losing people who won't respect your boundaries. But every time I see Ruby playing with her toys or hear her say her own name with pride, I know we made the right choice. She'll grow up knowing her parents had her back, that we valued her enough to fight for her. That's worth more than keeping peace with people who wouldn't respect our family. Janet's change didn't happen because we gave in or compromised. It happened because we held the line and made her choose between her control and her granddaughter. She finally chose Ruby. The real Ruby. Not the version she wanted to create,